The rain poured down in heavy sheets, drumming against the pavement as she hurried through the city streets. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her shoes worn from too many miles, walked instead of driven. But she didn't have time to think about that. Not when her world was crumbling around her. She clutched the eviction notice in one hand, her fingers gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled under the pressure. 2 weeks. That's all she had left before she lost the tiny apartment she had fought so hard to keep. 2 weeks to come up with an impossible amount of money. Her mind spun with possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. A second job? She was already working too. Alone? No bank would approve her with her credit. Asking for help? There was no one left to ask. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She hated feeling powerless, hated knowing that no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. And now, time was running out as she reached the bus stop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. "I have a proposition for you. It's unconventional, but it pays well. Meet me tonight." Her heart pounded. Unconventional? That could mean 100 different things. And yet she found herself typing back a single word, where. Later that evening, she stepped into the warm glow of an upscale restaurant, feeling out of place among the well-dressed patrons. Her friend was already waiting, a knowing smile on their face, as they slid a glass of water toward her. "I know you need money," they said, skipping any small talk. "And I know someone who needs a wife." She blinked. "Excuse me?" They leaned in slightly, lowering their voice. "It's not what you think. It's a business deal. He has his reasons, you have yours. You get married on paper, stay together for a while, and when it's over, you walk away with more money than you could ever make in a year." She stared at them, her mind struggling to catch up. It sounded ridiculous, insane. But as she sat there, thinking about the eviction notice still stuffed in her pocket, she realized something terrifying. She was considering it, because when you're drowning, you don't have the luxury of pride, and she was already sinking. She sat in silence, her fingers tapping restlessly against the cool surface of the table. Her friend's words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over. A marriage not for love, not for companionship, but as a transaction. It felt absurd, like something out of a movie. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to dismiss it completely. "What's the catch?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Her friend smirked slightly. "No catch, just rules. He needs a wife for a certain amount of time. You'll be expected to play the part publicly, at least. And when the contract ends, you both go your separate ways. No complications, no emotional entanglements." She swallowed. The words were simple enough, but something about them felt heavier than they should have. "And why does he need this arrangement?" "That's not for me to say," they replied, glancing at their watch. "But if you're interested, you'll meet him tomorrow. You'll get your answers." Then the ride home was quiet. Too quiet. Her mind refused to settle, torn between logic and desperation. She had always been the kind of person who figured things out on her own, who refused to take shortcuts or rely on anyone. But this wasn't about pride anymore. This was survival that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the bills stacked on her kitchen counter, the landlord's impatient voice, the feeling of helplessness that had crept into her life and refused to leave. And then she thought about what her friend had said. A marriage of convenience. No emotions, no risks except, deep down, she knew nothing was ever that simple. Morning came too soon. She barely touched her coffee, her stomach twisting with nerves, as she arrived at the address her friend had sent. The building was sleek and modern, the kind of place that screamed wealth and power. She took a deep breath before stepping inside. The receptionist greeted her with a polite nod, directing her to the top floor. The elevator ride felt endless, her pulse quickening with every passing second. And then the doors slid open, revealing a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that stretched across the city. And there he was. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, exuding an air of confidence that felt almost suffocating. He was composed, controlled like a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. "You must be her," he said without turning around. His voice was deep, smooth, but there was something unreadable about it. She crossed her arms, masking her nerves with defiance. "And you must be the man who thinks he can buy a wife." At that, he turned. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, she saw something flicker in his gaze, something sharp, calculating. "I don't buy people," he said evenly. "I make deals. And right now, you need one as much as I do." She hated that he was right. She took the seat he gestured toward, forcing herself to meet his gaze without wavering. "Fine. Tell me why you need this." He didn't hesitate. "Because appearances matter." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You'll have to be a little more specific." His jaw tightened slightly, as if he wasn't used to being questioned. "I'm in the middle of a business deal. A very important one. And the people I'm negotiating with, they value stability. Family. A wife would make things easier." She studied him. He was lying. Or at least, not telling her the full truth. But that wasn't her problem, was it? "And what do I get?" she asked, leaning forward. "How do I know you'll hold up your end of the bargain?" A slow smirk curved his lips, as if he found her defiance amusing. He reached into a folder on the desk, pulling out a document. A contract. Terms outlined, compensation guaranteed. She hesitated before taking the papers, scanning the details. A 6-month arrangement. A substantial payment. No legal ties beyond the marriage certificate. No intimacy required. It was a business deal, just like he'd said. And yet, something about it felt dangerously personal. She set the contract down, meeting his gaze once more. "And if I say no?" He didn't blink. "Then you walk away. And I find someone else." The words shouldn't have stung. But they did. She had a choice. She could leave now, go back to struggling, to fighting against the inevitable. Or she could say yes, step into a world that wasn't hers, and risk losing herself in the process. A deal was a deal. But something told her this was about to become much more than that. She didn't give him an answer right away. Instead, she walked out of that office with the contract in her bag and a storm in her mind. It felt too unreal, too calculated, but at the same time, it was the most logical way out of the mess she was drowning in. That night, she sat at her tiny kitchen table, the contract spread out in front of her. She traced the words with her fingers, reading and rereading them as if the ink itself could give her clarity. 6 months. That was all. A temporary arrangement, nothing more. She would play the role, collect the money, and move on with her life. No attachments, no emotions. But deep down, something about it made her uneasy. It wasn't just the idea of marriage, it was him. The way he looked at her, like he already knew what she would choose. Like he was always 10 steps ahead. Her landlord had given her one final warning earlier that day. Either she came up with the money or she was out. The deadline was looming over her, and she was out of options. So, with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, she picked up her pen and signed the contract. The next morning, she sent him a simple message, "I'm in." Minutes later, her phone rang. His voice was as smooth as ever, but this time, there was something almost amused about it. "Smart choice. Be ready by 7. We have an engagement to announce." She barely had time to process what that meant before a car arrived at her building that evening. The driver, who looked far too professional to be just a chauffeur, held the door open without a word. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The ride was silent, the city lights flashing past her window. When they pulled up to the venue, she felt the weight of what she was about to do settle on her shoulders. The event was grand, the kind of gathering where everyone knew everyone, where money and power flowed through conversations like currency. And then she. As the weeks passed, the lines between reality and the arrangement blurred. She had expected formality, a cold business deal with clear boundaries, but instead, she found herself caught in something far more complicated. He was distant yet protective, calculated yet unexpectedly thoughtful. He never missed a detail, whether it was noticing when she was uncomfortable in a crowded room, or ensuring her favorite tea was always stocked in the massive kitchen she was still getting used to. But just when she thought she was beginning to understand him, he would pull away, shutting down any moment of warmth between them. The public appearances continued, each one cementing the image of their perfect engagement. To the outside world, they were a power couple, flawless, in love, untouchable. But behind closed doors, the tension grew. Late one evening, she found herself standing in the dimly lit hallway of his house, staring at the door to his office. She knew he was in there, working late as always. A part of her told her to turn around, to leave things as they were. But another part, the part that had started to care far more than she should, pushed her forward. She knocked once before pushing the door open. He looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face, before he masked it with his usual unreadable expression. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. She hesitated before stepping inside, closing the door behind her. I needed to talk." His gaze sharpened slightly, as if he already knew where this was going. "About what?" She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "This. Us. This whole arrangement. Something isn't adding up." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched her, his fingers tapping against the desk in a slow, measured rhythm. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. "You needed a wife. I needed money. But there's more to this, isn't there? You're hiding something." For the first time since they had started this charade, she saw his expression falter. It was only for a second, but it was enough. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Who was that woman at the gala? The one who acted like she knew something I didn't?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice quieter than she expected, he said, "She was someone I once trusted. And she's been waiting for me to fail." Her stomach twisted. "Fail at what?" He exhaled, standing up and running a hand through his hair. "This isn't just about appearances. There's more at stake than I let on. If this marriage isn't convincing, if they find a reason to doubt us, everything I've built is at risk." She stared at him, realization hitting her like a wave. This wasn't just about business deals or family expectations. There were deeper consequences, ones he hadn't told her about. Before she could press further, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. "I need to take this," he said, his tone final. She hesitated, wanting to demand more answers, but something about the way his shoulders tensed told her now wasn't the time. Without another word, she turned and left the office, her mind spinning. That night, sleep never came. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly she had gotten herself into, and why, despite everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was falling for him. The next morning, she could still feel the weight of last night's conversation pressing down on her. Something was shifting between them, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. He had let her see a crack in his armor, but only for a moment. And now, more than ever, she needed to know what he was hiding. She moved through the house, trying to distract herself, but the air felt heavier, like something unseen was lingering just out of reach. When she stepped into the kitchen, she found him already there, leaning against the counter with a coffee in hand. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her for just a second too long. Before she could say anything, his phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't ignore it. He answered, his voice sharp. "Tell me you have something." She pretended not to listen, but the tension in his tone was impossible to ignore. Then suddenly, his entire body stiffened. What? His hand tightened around the cup, his jaw clenched. No, that's not possible. She watched as his grip turned white, his posture rigid. The call ended abruptly, and he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. What happened? She asked, cautiously. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he turned to face her, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. She's back. Her stomach dropped. Who? The silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. The one person who could destroy everything. She had barely begun to process his words when the doorbell rang. He didn't move at first, as if dreading whatever was waiting for him on the other side. Then, without a word, he walked to the door and pulled it open. And there she was, the woman from the gala. The one who had watched her with knowing eyes. The one who had spoken in riddles, as if she was waiting for the right moment to strike. "Hello, darling," the woman said, her voice smooth, her smile calculated. "Miss me?" Her heart pounded as she looked between them, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface. She had assumed this was about business, about power. But now, standing in the doorway of the life she had agreed to step into, she realized she had been wrong. This wasn't just about control. It was about the past. A past that was about to catch up to both of them in ways she never saw coming. The room felt colder now. She stood frozen, watching the woman in the doorway, the one who had been nothing more than a passing threat until now. But this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just business. The shift in his posture told her everything. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw locked, his entire body wound tight like a storm waiting to break. She stepped forward, trying to steady her voice. "Who is she?" The woman laughed softly, stepping inside without an invitation. "Oh, he hasn't told you." She turned to him, tilting her head. And here I thought honesty was part of a marriage. He didn't flinch, didn't react. "What do you want?" His voice was sharp, controlled, but she could hear the edge beneath it. The woman sighed, tapping her nails against the back of a chair. "You know why I'm here." She glanced at her. "I imagine your wife would love to know too." Her stomach twisted. Wife. The word still felt foreign, still felt like a mask she was wearing. But at this moment, it wasn't about their arrangement. It was about what this woman knew, about the part of his life he had kept from her. "I'm waiting," she said, crossing her arms. He exhaled, his eyes locked onto the woman. She was supposed to be gone. The woman smirked. "You really thought I'd disappeared just because you wanted me to?" She turned back to her. "I was his fiancée first." The words hit harder than they should have. Her heart pounded, her mind racing through every conversation, every moment she had spent wondering why he needed a wife so badly. But he never mentioned this. Never once. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "So, what happened?" The woman's expression darkened, and for the first time, something close to real anger flickered behind her eyes. "He left me." Her pulse quickened as she turned to him, waiting for an explanation. But he didn't speak, didn't offer a single word in his defense. The woman took a step closer, lowering her voice. "And now, I've come back for what's mine." A heavy silence fell over the room. She clenched her fists, her mind spinning. She had signed up for a contract, a temporary arrangement. But this was something else entirely. She looked at him, searching his face for something, anything that would tell her what to do next. And that's when she saw it. Not fear, not regret, but something much more dangerous. He wasn't just trying to protect himself. He was trying to protect her. And in that moment, she realized the truth. This wasn't just about money or appearances. This was about survival. She took a step back, her heart pounding. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the woman's gaze was locked onto him, waiting for a reaction. But he didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. The lies, the half-truths, the unspoken words between them. It had never been just a business deal. She had known that for a while now. But standing here, face to face with the past he had never spoken of, she realized just how deep this went. The woman's voice was quieter now, but no less sharp. "Tell her the truth," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Tell her what you did." His jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do." The woman scoffed. "That's what you tell yourself, isn't it?" She turned to her now, her expression unreadable. "Did he ever tell you why he really needed a wife? Why he was in such a hurry?" She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The woman smirked. "It wasn't just about business. It was about protection. He knew I was coming back, and he needed someone in his corner before I got here." Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to him, searching his face, but he still wouldn't look at her. "That's not true," he said, but there was something in his voice that made her doubt. The woman took a step closer. "Isn't it? Or did you really think this was about love?" The words hit harder than she expected. She had known from the beginning that love had nothing to do with their arrangement. But along the way, something had shifted. Somewhere in between the late-night conversations, the stolen glances, the way he had started looking at her like she was more than just a convenience, she had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it had become real. Now she wasn't so sure. She swallowed hard. "Is that true?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Did you marry me just to keep her away?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time since she had met him, he looked unsure. "No," he said finally. "It started that way. But it's not that simple anymore." Her heart ached at the hesitation in his voice. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that what they had, whatever it was, meant more than just a transaction. But doubt was creeping in now, filling the spaces between them. The woman crossed her arms. "Well, that's sweet. But it doesn't change anything." She looked at him again. "You owe me." He shook his head. "I don't owe you anything," the woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." And just like that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence that was almost unbearable. She felt like the ground beneath her had just shifted. She turned back to him. "What happens now?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That depends on what?" He finally met her eyes, and for the first time, there was something raw, something unguarded in his expression. "On whether or not you still trust me." She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe that everything they had been through wasn't just built on lies. But she wasn't sure anymore. She took a deep breath. "I don't know." His face fell just slightly, but he nodded. "That's fair." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had just happened hung between them, heavy and unrelenting. Then, finally, she whispered, "I just need time." He nodded again, but there was something in his eyes, something like fear, and for the first time since this all began, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Maybe he had already lost something too, and maybe that something was her.